Okay, so I've got quite a bit to talk about today, because everyone is building Hailey wrong, this time due to a misunderstanding regarding what you would typically call crit resist. And then in addition to that, there are some new weapon options that have come up that we will talk about with some math to back it up that will line up down to the decimal point. So for any keyboard warriors who want to get up in my comments section spewing nonsense, please for the love of fuck, just hear me out. To talk about how Hailey is being built wrong, we need to talk about crits, and even if you think you know about crit resist, I promise you don't know all of it. Many of you are aware of the concept of crit resists and that most bosses have them, be it for weapon crits or skill crits. The most famous example is where a guy got 100% crit rate on his gun and shot hard mode Devourer about 1200 times, and saw that he only actually had about a 72 to 73% crit rate instead of 100. The problem with that particular test is it was flawed in how it defined crit resist. Crit resist in other games usually means every crit has a chance to outright fail. So if you had maybe 50% crit and the enemy had a 50% crit resist, that means your actual crit rate would be around 25%. Since 50% of 50% is 25%, and half of your crits would fail. That is not what this game does at all. In this game, it is less accurate to call it a crit resist, and more so to call it a crit ceiling. To show this, I recreated the Devourer test that other guy did, and made several new ones. For the Devourer test, I used the Smithereens unique effect, and if you're not familiar with it, it makes it so if all pellets make contact with their target, then it replaces the base crit rate of all pellets with 100% instead of 1%. Ergo, all pellets should crit, theoretically. And after shooting 100 times, as each shot shoots 10 pellets, so 1,000 instances of damage, I saw 730 successful crits, so a 73% crit rate, which lines up with the testing from that other guy. But what about when you have more than 100% crit rate, or less than the lowered crit rate as well? Because a lot of people are under the mistaken impression that a boss's ceiling modifier adds into your crit rate additively. So say you had 150% crit rate, and then the boss had a 50% crit modifier, 150 minus 50 equals 100, meaning you can still crit 100% of the time, and that's a load of shit. And to illustrate that, I redid the Smithereens test, except this time against a level 1 Vulgus in the laboratory, and 949 of 1000 shots crit. So we'll just say a 95% even crit rate, meaning the enemy has a 5% ceiling reduction. Then I took Secret Garden, but with the mods I had and the weapon roll on it, put the crit rate of Secret Garden to 137.7%. And then I did another 1000 shots, and this time I got 943 of 1000, meaning it is practically the exact same, about a 95% crit rate despite being overcapped. The extra crit didn't do anything for us. Crit resist is not a resist, it is a cap or a ceiling reduction, whichever you would prefer. And just to further show that it doesn't add into your crit rate and reduce it anywhere, because it only adds a cap on the total crit rate you can achieve against your target, I did Secret Garden again, but this time with 56% crit rate, 56 instead of 50, the base, simply because of the weapon roll having crit rate. I couldn't remove that. This time I saw an even 550 shots crit of 1000, so a roughly 55% crit rate, which is close enough to the 56. It doesn't match up perfectly, but there's always going to be some variation on tests like these. The point is more that if the 5% ceiling reduction were additive to our crit rate, the difference between 50 and 55% observed crit rate is something we would absolutely be able to see, because that is a huge gap to cover. Obviously, most of these tests were done with weapons, but we do know that bosses have caps against both weapons and guns separately, as say Gluttony has something like a 50% firearm ceiling reduction and an 80% skill ceiling reduction, which is utterly fucking insane. And I did do the Devourer test just using Hailey's first ability while over 100% crit rate, and I did see roughly the exact same ceiling reduction of 27 to 28%. How does this tie into people building Hailey wrong? I shit you not, guys, go around and look, and every single build guide you can find on YouTube, you're gonna see them running all 4 crit mods on her, and it's dumb. Even you, Mewy, you stupid piece of shit. Hailey has a base crit rate of 5%, but her third ability, while active, will grant you stacks, where each stack increases the base crit rate of her skills by 2.5% up to 16 stacks, granting you a maximum added base crit rate of 40%, with the 5% adding up to 45. If you run all 4 crit mods, you are going to be over the 100% crit rate, but if you take off Insight and leave the other 3, which are mandatory for increasing your crit damage, you end up at 86.535% crit rate instead. Guys, a level 1 Vulgus has a 5% ceiling modifier. I imagine everything in the entire fucking game has at least a 5% crit reduction on the ceiling, meaning that 100% crit rate on anything you ever use is wasting crit rate. And if Devourer, the lord of pushover bosses that you can bully with an SMO fart, has a 27% ceiling modifier, I think it is safe to say that all other hard mode bosses will have the same amount, if not more, like Gluttony does. Because of this, I'm just gonna say it. Any crit rate higher than 75% on a boss fight is stupid. You do not need that 4th crit mod on her, because there's no chance in hell you're ever gonna fight a boss that will actually let you take advantage of the full 86.5%. Stop using skill insight on Hailey. Now, of course, that begs the question, how do you build Hailey then? We're going to break down Hailey's 4th ability when making this build, because it has 2 parts to it, and one part is only modified by Hailey's mods, whereas the other part is only modified by the weapon she has equipped, as well as the mods on that weapon. The weapon or its mods do not modify the skill damage, and the Descendant mods do not modify the weapon damage. I see a lot of confusion going around on that right now. We're going to start with the skill damage side of things before we get into the weapon side. I'm not going to be explaining the skill damage math behind this, so if you are confused on any of the numbers or don't know the full equation for skill damage, please, for the love of God, just go watch this other video. You only need to watch it once to understand, and it will greatly help you understand how to make your own builds in the future, or identify if another build is full of shit. As we just discussed, we are going to throw the 3 crit mods on: skill concentration, front lines, emergency measures, etc. And assuming her 3rd skill is active and at max stats, that means our crit rate will be at 86.535, and our crit damage multiplier will be at 4.588. Next, we will pump skill power as much as we can, using Chill Specialist, Glacial Syncytium to boost our chill power ratio, and then throwing on Spear and Shield to boost base power ratio, and then Dangerous Ambush as well to boost the same thing under the right conditions. Now, what is great about this is that you have complete freedom to slot whatever the fuck you want here. You have 3 remaining mod slots. If you want to edge out a tiny bit more damage, you can slot Focus on Singular, not Shot Focus, by the way, because Singular will come out better in pretty much every scenario, though both do virtually nothing, so both are probably not worth slotting unless you're trying to min-max. Alternatively, you can bulk up on HP so that way a stiff breeze doesn't murder you. It is entirely up to you. The only thing I will say though is that if you decide to use like cooldown on MP conversion and nimble fingers, it does let you have a much shorter downtime between zenith casts. And if you're super tryhard, you can try to roll with multi-talented and recast your 3 just before the last shot, as Rye pointed out, and that'll lead to the least downtime between casts. However, I don't believe that's even worth the effort of trying to make it all work without screwing it up or something stupid. And I also don't see the harm in having downtime between casts, because then if you have time between casts, just use your 2nd ability to blow a hole into the surface of Mars before pulling your sniper out again. These 3 slots are going to boil down to quality of life and situational preference, and do not ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Next up is the weapon split of the damage, and just to reiterate, the weapon does not modify the skill side, and neither does the skill side modify the weapon side. The only thing the weapon side does that can technically modify the skill side, and not even really then, is your weapon's round per magazine stat from both the modules and the substats. That only increases skill damage technically because it increases the amount of shots you can fire, but the damage itself remains untouched by anything that you would put on your weapon or the weapon itself. That said, unlike the skill side, I actually really want to explain how the weapon side damage works. However, if I do that, it'll be a 30-minute video, and fuck that. So instead, I will put out a video tomorrow, probably, that explains the full math of guns in general throughout the entire game, and then at the end of the video I'll explain the differences between regular gun math and zenith gun math. If you're watching after I've already made that video as well, then I'll link it in the video cards, which would probably pop up in the top right of the screen right about now. However, because I won't be explaining the full damage calculations, I will instead show 3 quick examples of my calculator's predicted damage versus actual damage on hard mode Pyro, and hope you will trust me to know what the fuck I'm talking about, because they will match up exactly. I'll be using Afterglow Sword for these examples, but do not take that to mean Afterglow Sword is the best. It is just what I have built out right now, and if I can show you the exact values on one weapon across numerous scenarios, that means I can show you the exact values on all of them. I also don't have the weapon substats selectable just yet on the site, so for now I've literally hard-coded the rolls into Afterglow to match exactly what I have on my gun, just to make sure that all these stats are there to line up with what you're going to see in game. I also won't be using Dangerous Ambush in these examples, as that will factor in later. But with the examples to prove accuracy out of the way, hopefully you can trust what comes next, because now I'm going to talk about the 3 weapon options as well as their best build and damage spreads. Starting with Afterglow, as shown earlier, this is the build I recommend for it. For all 3 weapons, the best possible rules in the substats will be Colossus attack, crit damage, firearm attack, and then rounds per magazine. However, rounds per mag must be a perfect maximum gold roll of exactly 12% on any of the weapons. If it is anything less, it's not going to give you an extra shot, and it will be a damage loss, and weak point damage would be a better slot than that. So ideally, some other people have mentioned that if you you do decide to reroll your weapon, that you just roll all of them until you can find a perfect mag roll, and then lock that in and then start rolling the other ones around it, because that 12% is significantly more important than all the rest. Note that I've also hard-coded these rolls into each weapon for all the math that is about to come, and also at their maximum value, which is different between the snipers and Perforator. I didn't forget that. Similarly, I bumped the Reactor stats to all their maximum values as well, because we're going to talk about their peak condition for all three weapons, both weak spots and not. And then also remember that these values I'm going to show are for the damage after Pyro's damage reduction applies to them, simply for the sake of showing that things are doing what they should be and lining up to be what they are. But without damage reduction, their values are much, much higher. And if you genuinely care about the true damage values, you can just turn off the DR toggle when you visit the site. Also, I realized just barely I forgot to mention Cryo's damage bonus from Hailey's first ability. It straight up just takes the sum total of your weapon's side damage, including whatever elemental extra bonus you have, and then cuts it in half and applies it again as a separate number. Moving on to the weapons though, Afterglow is going to rank lowest on our list of options today, but not by nearly as much as people try to make you believe. For all three choices, by the way, I've set up a crit ceiling reduction of 25% for both skill and weapon, so neither will achieve or factor in a crit rate higher than 75%, so we can keep things in line with our ceiling discussion from earlier. With a body shot damage spread over 8 shots of 61.4 million and a weak spot spread of 72.1 million, the total damage is still competitive with Lepix, but arguably much easier to disperse on a boss and in a much shorter time, without needing to wait out the dot ticks to do your full damage. There isn't a whole lot to talk about here. It's a good weapon choice despite all the people proselytizing for Piercing Light right now. Piercing Light comes out in second place for total damage for skill cast with a body shot spread of 61.6 million, just a touch higher, and a weak point spread of 74.3 million. It is, at most, a 3% absolute gain over Afterglow Sword, and only if you hit 100% of your weak spot shots. And if you do body shot the whole time, they are literally the exact fucking same. Most people trying to make this comparison are using relative comparisons for base damage, but guys, the math is so much more than that. Like, holy fuck. If anyone wants to prove me wrong mathematically on this, I dare you to try. To wrap up Piercing Light though, it is going to be the highest DPS option theoretically, not the highest damage option. Perforator comes out next as the highest total damage option, not the highest DPS theoretically. And what makes this particularly amusing is that Perforator's body shot spread comes out 6 million higher than Piercing Light's weak point spread at 78.8 million in total, and then with a weak point spread of 83.6 million. Perforator is a pretty funny option touted by Mui recently, where in exchange for throwing away like 70% of your weapon side damage, you're able to gain 3 more shots in your magazine count due to the interaction with the payout mod, where after a weak point hit, you gain infinite ammo for 3 seconds with a cooldown afterwards. That might sound really fucking stupid, and Mui did a god-awful job showing the math to prove it, lazy motherfucker. But he is correct. Perforator is the genuine king, since the overwhelming majority of our damage comes from the skill side of the split, and adding more shots leads to the result I've already shown you in the damage breakdowns. It absolutely wins. There are some key points to note here. For instance, you won't get the 3 extra shots unless you switch your settings to change the firing mode, so that way you get full auto triggers on semi-automatic weapons. And because of that, you're able to just hold down the trigger instead of repeatedly click over and over. Another note is that the DPS argument for Piercing Light is not actually that strong. Piercing Light maintains comparable total damage if you land all your weak point shots, but nobody has 100% weak point hit rates. Ever. Not to mention, if you're sweating for every weak point hit, you're typically aiming your shots, and aiming can take time. And I know we're going to get some god-level gamers that pop in and tell us all to just get better, but after we're done telling them to shut the fuck up, we can all acknowledge that in most cases, just holding down the trigger and firing the literal millisecond it is possible to do so is usually going to be better DPS than Tweedle and Deedle over there trying to maintain perfect aim. Even if the theoretical perfect DPS is technically lower, the practical DPS is often going to be higher. Lastly, another massive benefit to the larger shot count is being able to take better advantage of dangerous ambush. I'm sure all of you have experienced at least once the frustration of running out of shots before the boss stood back up, be it solo or in a group setting, and with more shots to spare, you've got more time on the down state. And since we've already stated the overwhelming majority of your damage comes from the skill side, more ambush utilization is going to be uncontested in practical cases, which my calculator cannot currently show. But the point is more so that even if every weapon is in perfect condition, which the calculator has shown, Perforator's body shot spread is uncontested. On that note, before we finish up the vid with components and reactor reactors, whatnot. Be sure to go thank Mui for fucking around with that stuff. As I said before, he did a god-awful job proving or explaining why it was actually better, besides saying herder more shots. And he's a massive goober, but he is a good guy and you should check him out. To wrap up though, components and reactors. For the reactor, we want a chill singularity reactor with skill attack against Colossus and singular power boost ratio. If you're confused on why those substats specifically, please go watch the video on reactors I mentioned at the start of the video. I break down the skill mouth in there and specifically address Hailey reactor options in it as well. For components, the only set you should ever run on Hailey is the Slayer set. Not only does it give you a 26.1% base skill power boost ratio, which is in the same bucket as Dangerous Ambush, but it also gives you rounds per magazine to help improve your shot count. And by the way, that bonus was already factored into all the math in the entire video. If you run any other set on her, you are running an unbelievable damage loss. It is mandatory. For your rolls, it's pretty much the standard shit though. HP and MP out of combat, max MP and MP in combat, MP recovery modifier in defense, and then shield and max shield. As always, maybe a day after, I'll push an update to my website that includes all the Hailey calcs and functions used in this video. So if you want to fuck around with it yourself and see what kind of damage you can get in your own personal context, you'll be able to do that.